Hey y'all, Yolanda here. And I just wanted to pop on with this legal briefs to kind of address the issue of why today, January 10th, is so historic as it relates to American politics and as it relates to the criminal justice system. In short, we will have a president entering into the Oval Office and the presumable leader of the free world who is a convicted felon, a 34-time convicted felon, a 34-time convicted felon who will face no punishment. And on one hand, having served in both of those roles, I get why the judge did what he did throughout this in terms of delaying the sentencing, especially when we're in the middle of an election. And I know there was so much confusion once he became a felon. Well, how can he still run? Well, he wasn't a felon at the time that he filed for office. Now he is. Now he cannot file. That's at least one thing to take into consideration. The other thing to take into consideration is that now that he's a convicted felon, the only way that these felonies go away is if somehow the convictions are overturned on appeal. Now, these are state cases, so it would have to go through the appellate process first, unless they try to do what they just did, which is bypass that, go straight to the Supreme Court when they tried to get the sentencing halted. And the Supreme Court in a 5-4 decision said no. Very surprised that happened. And that's a whole nother brief in terms of how the judges, the direction that the judges went, and the fact that there really was no basis for them to halt the sentencing, right? Because they knew or perceived at that point that there wasn't going to be a punishment anyway, right? And they were aware, or at least it was well believed, that it was going to be this unconditional discharge that the judge actually does. What does that say in general? Well, one, he can't run again. And I want to address that issue just as a side note, because I've seen on social media where top people saying, well, he could, run again and say it wasn't consecutive terms or blah, 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 blah. No, 22nd Amendment, Article 1 and 2, but specifically Article 1 addresses that directly. A person cannot run for president more than twice. That's literally what it says in Section 1. It doesn't say consecutive or non-consecutive. And it's very clear you cannot run and be elected, rather, more than twice. So, for example, but it also says if a person is vice president and they take a partial term of presidency, or they become president in that regard, if it's 2 years or less, if it's 2 years or less, they could run twice. If it's 2 years or more, they can only run once. That's not even an issue because he's now a convicted felon. Unless there's some reason or basis as a matter of law, not as a matter of fact, to overturn any of these convictions for example, insufficient evidence or is contrary to the law. That's the only way these convictions get overturned. And when you have decisions made by jurors, which presumably had sufficient facts for each of the elements of each of the charge times 34, the likelihood of 34 counts being overturned by the Supreme Court is nil, right? So he's going to remain a convicted felon. What that also means, interestingly enough, is that he can still vote. Because he is a Florida resident, because he's a Florida resident, he could still be allowed to vote. Had he been a New York resident, he would not, because that's controlled by state law. And the fact that because he didn't get a punishment, he's not on probation, didn't get an active sentence or any of that, under this unconditional discharge, he gets no punishment. And that's what that means. So the unconditional discharge, it submits the conviction, but he doesn't get probate. He doesn't get put on probation. He doesn't have to do community service, gets no jail time, no punishment. And that also means, though, because it happened in the state of New York, he has to give a DNA sample. He cannot own a firearm because he is a convicted felon. That, I think, is probably, as an attorney, the most disturbing, and probably just as a person, the most disturbing, that there is no punishment. But I get why there's not. I don't agree with it, but I get why there's not, because had he sentenced him to prison, let's say during the course of the campaign, that's most certainly going to the Supreme Court, which would very easily, on a 6-3 decision at least, would have most certainly had an issue and would have put the whole conviction or the whole set of cases in jeopardy. And giving him an active sentence now would have given him a basis on appeal to take that, more than likely to try to bypass that and send that up to the Supreme Court on an emergency basis, to try to have that sentence set aside if that were the case. And again, with this Supreme Court, who's already given him carte blanche to do whatever he does as long as it's an official act, we already know how that's going to go. But I think about this in a broader sense, like, what does that mean to people, an everyday person who makes a mistake as a teenager or what have you, and they have a felony on their record and they're having trouble getting any job. There's certain licensing privileges they can't have, all of these things. And because of the juxtaposition of the power, control, misinformation, all of those things that led to his election, he gets to be the president of the United States as a convicted felon. Not only what does that show to the world, what does that say to our kids? I don't know. I thought about that. I really thought about that today because I don't have kids, but I work with kids through my nonprofit, and I teach them about the justice system by a mock trial scenario. It's an experience, actually. iSpeakNow.org. Anyway, but imagine teaching your kids that integrity is important. You've got to do the right thing. If you don't do the right thing, there's certain punishments that you can face. If you do this under a sentencing grid or guideline, you're going to go to jail. You're going to have probation. These are the things that you have to do. These are the things that are going to happen to you. These are the risks that you take if you make bad decisions. And yet we say this to our children, and in real time, our same children are, I can't imagine, confused, like, but he gets to do all of those things and still be the most powerful man in this country and leverage his power with the pen or a keystroke. Wow. And sometimes I get why people, I think what's going to happen is that what's going to be even more disconcerting, upsetting, and just outright ridiculous is when Jack Smith's report is released, because they tried to keep that from being released, and the 11th Circuit said no. And I don't imagine that the Supreme Court is going to have a basis to keep that from being released, because this is now the third time that the Eileen Cannon has been overruled by the circuit. This is now the third time. I'm curious to see what happens when that comes out. Now, is that going to make a difference? Who knows? Because we do have special elections that are coming up that could quite possibly turn the tide of the House, and allow Democrats to get control of the House again. But that's another brief for another time as we deal with the special election issue. I don't know about you, but I don't know if I want to be here in the U.S. on Inauguration Day. We'll see. But anywho, that's the issue. That's the crime. But there's no punishment.